We have now entered the promised land. Hi, my name is Kendall Brian Hunter, and this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point. It's try to get the Come Follow Me lessons encapsulated in just as few points as possible, under 15 minutes if I can. I always show up. I always come prepared. We never take roll, and it's bring your own refreshments. And today it's a empty bottle of eggnog that for some reason I saved. My birthday's in December, so I always associate it with my birthday. And if you want to do a sponsorship, I'm willing to do that. Eggnog, it's makes your Christmas perfect. But here we are in the book of Joshua, and so we're entering the promised land right now, and we're having this is an important shift, not just in the shift of leadership from Moses to Joshua, then to a point where we really don't have a centralized leadership in Israel, but it's also a shift, is that we finished reading let me do that. There we go. Finished reading the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. And in some ways, you could consider the book of Joshua as an appendix to the 5 books of Moses. Or another way you can categorize it, this is the beginning of the historical sections. So we've had the theological sections with the book of Moses. Now we're shifting into historical stuff. So it may be a little bit easier reading because you're dealing with stories. It reads a little bit more like a novel, which what we're used to reading, and we can embrace these stories if sometimes you're put off by reading about the Levitical sacrifice or the depictions of the temple. Sorry, my tongue's tied. The descriptions of the temple, and sorry, my knee just hit my phone there. So it should be a little bit easier reading if you can get past the King James language. So make sure that you're reading the Bible dictionary and also about the Joshua the person, the book of Joshua. And also Howard W. Hunter back in 1982 gave a talk about the life of Joshua, and I'll put a link to it below in the notes section. So this is a time to change in leadership, and this happens on my mission. We switch mission presidents, and that's always kind of a dramatic and exciting thing. That you get used to things doing one way with one person, then you have to shift over. And we learned some patterns on changes in leadership. For example, the Lord told Joshua to be strong and of a good courage. He also told him to meditate upon the law and to observe to do the law. And he also said that the law would not come from Moses or from Joshua. That is, Moses gave the law of Moses, and so your job is to act on and to teach the principles of it. And it's a little bit like with Brigham Young. Joseph Smith, every time he turned around, he's getting a new section of the Doctrine and Covenants. Brigham Young got one section. What happened is how he led the church is through general epistles, and it was a different type of thing. But Brigham Young didn't get the revelations like Joseph Smith. And it's the same thing as Joshua did not pick up on, didn't have have recorded revelations as Moses had, because it's already been revealed and said, okay, here's the game plan. Your duty is to make sure you implement it. So it's a little bit, it's leadership, but leadership done in a different fashion where you're saying, okay, let's go back and study this and make sure we're following the revealed blueprint. And like I said, we're getting into historical areas. So you send spies into the area. You have the incident with Rahab the harlot. And some people raise questions like, why did Paul mention her in Hebrews? It's Hebrews 11, verse 31. If she's a harlot, why is she celebrated? Well, without dismissing any of the problems with sexual sins, that she did help the spies out and did help the work of the Lord be fulfilled. There's also another thing, too, is in the Mideast and also along the Fertile Crescent, you had prostitutes were associated with temple worship, and you can read about this in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Also in the DaVinci Code is that they have this mysterious incident where Sophie sees her father do something and it had an effect upon her. That's what her father was doing, is getting involved in this ancient practice of temple prostitution. That could be an interpretation. I don't know if it holds water or not. It's just not clear, so don't get too bent out of shape if you don't quite have an answer. They go to Jericho, and you have the story of Jericho's walls falling down. Then you have the invasion of the city Ai, which I'll get to a little bit later. And then you have Joshua's death, where he gives a speech about choose ye this day whom you will serve. So let's talk about Ai. And they invade the city. Joshua says, okay, don't take spoils. And it's similar to with King Saul and Samuel, where the prophet of the leader says, don't do this, and then people ignore it, and bad things happen. That's kind of the book. So that's the summary of the Book of Mormon. They ignore the prophets, bad things happen. And the same thing, we're going to be reading about this in the Bible. And so what happened is, this raises this question. If one person does a bad thing, how does it affect the whole, the relationship between the parts of the whole? If you have a ward and one person is doing bad things, does that affect the entire ward? Well, yeah, if the bishop or the stake president lets stuff slide, it can have an effect. Another example of this is in section 84 with the condemnation. And what that is that missionaries were going out and they weren't teaching from the Book of Mormon. And so when you read section 84, it says that your minds were darkened in times past because of light-mindedness, and you've treated lightly the things which you've received, and that this vanity unbelief has brought the church under condemnation, and you solve it by teaching from the Book of Mormon and studying the Book of Mormon. And this is something President Benson talked about, that missionaries were teaching from the Bible, not from the Restoration Scriptures, and you're supposed to use the Book of Mormon as a point of gathering. And it was such a problem that it brought the church under condemnation. Another way to think about this is with tithing and living the United Order. There's a funny story from the life of Heber C. Kimball, is where he was in the endowment house, and there's a company about to go through the endowment house. And he stopped and said, look, there's a company, there's people who aren't worthy. We're asking you to step out. Don't go through the session. And no one came up. So he asked him, look, there's someone here. There's people who are unworthy, who should not be in the session. We're asking you to step out so we can proceed with it. And so finally he said, look, if you don't step out of here, I'm going to call out your names. And a couple get up and left. They had been living in sin. Another thing like this is this is a secular point of view. It comes from Steve Jobs, and he had this expression, bozo explosion. It says if you have a company and you have one person who's off the wall, what happens? You get a bozo explosion, because you're tolerating someone who's off the wall, and it just gives everyone else permission to be off the wall. And that's what you're reading about here. And so they go there, they find the stuff, and they kill his family. And once again, I'm not shying away from these issues, that this seems very harsh to us, and make sure that we're not imposing our standards upon stuff in the past, just because it was a different time and a different cultural system. But if you have questions about this, you can always pray for the gift of knowledge and let God reveal an answer to you. So that's the city of Ai. Another topic I'd like to talk about is with memorials. Remember, this is get to the point. I'm not going really deep. I'm trying to get this under 10 minutes, and we're at 7:41 right now. So memorials. So when they enter the promised land, the Jordan River parts, just like the Red Sea parted. They pick up stones as memorials. Later, with Joshua's death, they have the stone, and they set it by the oak tree, which is another memorial. And so if you have the opportunity to attend church historical sites, are you attending them to connect yourself with history? Are you doing with a family history? Are you visiting family historical sites? Like when you go to the hometown, are you visiting areas and schools, places where your ancestors live? Because we have a problem with the generation gap, is that sometimes generations don't latch on to stuff of previous generations. And, you read about that in the Book of Mormon, album of the youngest generation. And one way you do this is make sure you're teaching your children and that you're preserving the history. Are you taking the Joseph Smith Papers Project history seriously? Or if that's a little bit too technical to you, are you reading Saints? Or are you reading the other historical books like the History of the Church, Comprehensive History of the Church? Our Heritage, which is an earlier book. Before that, you had Truth Restored, which was written by President Hinckley, and that's what we used on my mission. Those are all good resources to familiarize yourself with church history and turn to them. So here we are. Those are the topics I'd like to cover, and so we're at the Christ quotient part. So first of all, we're learning about Christ with this, is that, he gives a revelation in the Torah with the Pentateuch, and so the business becomes now implementing it. The same thing with the Doctrine and Covenants. We kind of know how things are supposed to work, and are you implementing them? Or are you just kicking back at God and saying, no, we want to do things our way? Another thing, are we meditating upon the law? Are we taking scripture study seriously? Are we just trying to race through it so we can meet the goal from the bishop or the stake president, and we're just kind of like scanning our eyes over? Are we stopping and sometimes just reading the same verse over and over again to make sure that we're understanding it properly? Are we taking notebooks with it as we're using notebooks as we study? Another thing, too, is are we choosing Christ? Because Christ is the point. Now, I'd like to talk about something a little bit that I didn't talk about at the last lesson. It's this prophecy in Deuteronomy 18, 45 about a prophet arising. This is an important prophecy. It's in Deuteronomy 18:15, Acts 7:37, 1 Nephi 22:20 and 21, 3 Nephi 20, verse 23. And it's a prophecy about Jesus Christ, that there's going to be a prophet coming and you're supposed to hearken to him. You paid attention to Moses, who's the mediator of the first covenant. Now we're going to have another prophet who's greater than Moses coming, and you need to follow him. And use this as a guide as you're reading the rest of the Bible, is that this is foreshadowing Jesus Christ's mission. It's what Abinadi talked about, making sure that you're seeing Christ, as you're studying the Old Testament, that you are seeing Christ, because Christ is the point.